Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today we have a really special Houston Chronicle Live. We have the K-12 education team here with us today. But for now, let's give everyone a few minutes to join and get settled in. And actually, while we're waiting for everyone to join, if you could go ahead and drop in the chat, I would love to hear, if you're joining with us today, like which neighborhood in Houston you're joining from, and also like, I know we probably have most of you interested in HISD, but if you're out in the suburbs, I'd love to hear like what district you're zoned to suburban district wise. So if you're KDISD, Cy-Fair, Conroe, would just love to see, why you're joining us today and where you're joining from. All right, Woodland Heights, we've got someone from Garden Oaks, from the Heights. And of course, there's a lot of HISD readers in the house today. Okay, A-Leaf, HISD. Someone from Austin is joining. That's interesting. And while everyone's getting situated, I'm just going to go ahead and start reading our introductions. We have a larger panel today than we usually do, so I'll just go ahead and get started. But keep it coming. We'd love to see where people are joining in from. And I really enjoy in these events when it's more of a back and forth, and we're seeing engagement, we're seeing you drop in comments and questions. So please keep that coming. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and do introductions. Megan Machaca is a Houston ISD reporter, and she's also one of the authors of our report card newsletter. If you're not signed up for that, it is a must read if you're interested in education in the Houston area. Megan joined the Chronicle in 2023, and she was previously the higher education reporter at the Statesman. And Megan's a UT alum, so hook 'em. I'm also one as well. So yeah, go Megan. And then next, but we have several HIC reporters on our team. Nusaiba Mazan, you might have seen her byline. She joined us in 2023 also, and was previously a business reporter, but now she covers HISD. She has for I think several months now. She's also another person who authors the report card newsletter. And she previously had stints at the Austin American Statesman as well, and also the Green Bay Press Gazette. So Nusaiba, thanks for joining us today. And then we also have two relatively new additions to our education team. So first we have Claire Partain, and she was actually also previously had previously covered the Woodlands for the Chronicle. And so you might have recognized her if you live in the Woodlands. She wrote the Woodlands Insider newsletter, and she joined us fairly recently as a HIC reporter covering specifically how the state takeover is affecting student achievement. So really interesting and fascinating topic. And last but certainly not least, we have Elizabeth Sander. And Elizabeth, we were just joking, we have a lot of HIC is an important topic to our readers, and there's a lot happening with the state takeover, but let's not forget the suburban districts. There's a lot of stories and important things happening out there. So Elizabeth has a job of covering several districts actually out in the suburbs. So, and I see some, of course I see in the chat too, we have we have not just HIC, but Fort Bend. I'm seeing A-Leaf, I'm seeing Spring Branch. So thanks for joining us today. All right, let's go ahead and get started. It's 3 minutes past the hour. Please keep your comments coming. If you have comments or questions, we have time at the end of this hour to try to answer them. I don't know if we'll get to every question, but we'll try our best, especially if we think that your question is pertinent to, a wider group of people. So let's just get started here. HISD went back to school earlier this month, and it's been a little bumpy with, building issues, staff turnover, et cetera. Megan, can you just quickly explain just what are the big stories that we're following this back to school season?
Sure. So set the stage a little bit. We are entering year two of the state takeover and the second year of Superintendent Mike Miles and an appointed board of managers overseeing the district. I'll let my fellow colleagues kind of dive deeper into the specifics, but some of the things that we're watching are the expansion of the new education system, which is Miles's reform program into now half the district schools. We're also looking at above average teacher and staff turnover and how that affects students in the schools, and also looking at student enrollment, which has been declining in HISD for several years, but its data shows that it's happening more in these NES schools. And we're also looking at, I would say, kind of general district infrastructure, so HVAC problems, bus problems, and how different issues are affecting students in the district. each of the HISD reporters cover different topics, but kind of the primary issue that I'm focused on for the next several months is the bond election. So HISD has proposed a $4 billion school bond, and that'll be on the November 5th ballot. And it's important for several reasons, but one of the biggest ones to me is that this is gonna be the first time that Houston voters will be able to cast a ballot that will meaningfully affect the operations of the district under the state takeover. The board is no longer elected, so this is the one chance that voters have to kind of have a really direct say on how the district works and kind of give their point of view on things.
Yeah, that's great. And I know we're actually going to cover and go into the bond a little more deeply later in the Zoom. But for now, talking about back to school again, specifically regarding turnover. Nusaiba, I know you've covered this a bit. Is the teacher or student turnover worse this year than in previous years? And is that contributing to back to school issues, you think?
Teacher turnover is higher, and employee departures for the district are higher this past school year than the 5 previous past school years. And what that means is that students are returning to campuses with a lot of new faces there, and while that means that the district has to do hiring, a lot of hiring over the summer to replace vacancies. The district says that it is approaching and has reduced vacancies. And so that we'll see more about what that means for students and to what extent the district has actually filled vacancies for the upcoming school year.
And do you think that, like, as far as these vacancies go, like, how are the schools even dealing with it? Are they just hiring in maybe some teachers who don't have licenses, or like what's the stopgap measure?
Yeah, we're seeing that they are hiring a lot of uncertified teachers. The last number that was provided by the district was 850 uncertified teacher hires, and that was tied to summer hiring, and that was at the beginning of the school year.
Okay, that's interesting. That's good to know. So Claire, I know you've actually been covering a really tragic storyline that's happened, around the start of the school year, and of course, we're all talking about the tragic death that happened in an HISD middle school. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. Can you tell us like the latest on that?
Yeah, so just for some background, Landon Payton was a new transfer to Marshall Middle School when he suffered a medical emergency in the school's gym and later died. And so a few days later, his father reviewed some footage, claimed that the nurse maybe didn't have experience. The district since defended that, but the Houston Federation of Teachers and the family's lawyer has stated that AED may not have been working. So looking into that, we don't have any of that confirmed yet. And the family is waiting for his cause of death to see whether they're going to file a lawsuit. But yeah, it's a really sad story. The district has since said that around 85% of the district's AEDs were working as of August 1st. And there was one working at each school and an average of 3 working at every school, but we're not sure if there was one working at that school, and that means around 15% weren't working across the district at the time. So that's something we're looking into.
Yeah, for sure. That's good to know. And so kind of moving on to the suburban districts, again, we're all thinking about the start of the school year, et cetera. Elizabeth, I'm wondering, I know you cover several districts, but can you tell us, a little bit more? Their issues look a lot different from HISD. Like, what are the biggest stories coming out of districts like Fort Bend or Cyfair?
Yeah, for sure. So I think I'm going to start with Cyfair because it's the third largest district in Texas, and I've spent a lot of time reporting on Cyfair ISD recently. But I would just say that right now, Cyfair ISD is definitely feeling the effects of their budget crunch that they had to make at the end of last spring, and they had a $138 million deficit, I believe, which is a pretty large number for a district to have to find a way to cut. So obviously some of that came out of their fund balance or their savings account, whatever you'd want to call it. But some of the other places they had to look for that, to make those cuts were in the transportation department. And one thing that's been really, aggravating some parents this year is that Cypher ISD historically had busing for all students, which is one of the reasons it was a destination district in the Houston area. A lot of families moved out there. And this year they had to institute a new rule where the state doesn't actually mandate that you bus students within 2 miles of the campus. So for middle school and high school students in Cypher ISD that live within 2 miles of the campus, they're no longer receiving bus services. And for elementary school students that live within 1 mile of the campus, they're no longer receiving bus services. So, I went out there on the first day of school, I think it was last week, and followed a family along on their walk to an elementary school. And it was only 15 or 20 minutes, but there wasn't a single sidewalk and there was a busy 4-lane road. And it just really put it into perspective of what so many families are dealing with in the area with the changes. And I know there's been a lot of animosity, I think, between the community and the upper administration and the leadership for having to make some of those cuts. Additionally, I would say one thing that Cypher had to do, or what they decided to do, was to cut half of the librarian staff. And so you're definitely seeing some of those impacts where school's starting now, and their plan was to have librarians that kind of like let's say they were umbrella librarians, so they would work in 4 different campuses and kind of travel between them or something like that. And so there are certainly days where high school students don't have the libraries open and they don't have librarians. So I mean, that's been a big shift, I think, for going forward. We'll have to see. And then the last thing I would touch on in Cypher is their board actually recently made a pretty unprecedented decision in, I believe it was in May, to remove 13 chapters from 5 state-approved textbooks. And so, the curriculum staff have been working all summer to try and find instructional materials, because you have to have instructional materials for the chapters that were removed. And while some have been found, others still, they haven't found something that can actually support the new TEKS. So they may have to go out and buy new textbook chapters, and some of that curriculum is actually supposed to be taught within the next 2 months. So I think there's definitely a crunch there. And also, just as some background, the chapters that were removed delves too far in the realm for the Board of Trustees into COVID-19 vaccines, cultural and religious diversity, and climate change, which is a decision that angered many constituents in Cypher who maybe felt like that didn't represent their values. And so you've seen a lot of kind of, push and pull between the community and the board. And then in Fort Bend ISD, and I will, hand it off back to HISD, but in Fort Bend ISD, the biggest news story of the week for sure is the library policy changes that the board made on Monday. The community came out in force against them. The library policy revisions that were passed allow the superintendent sole authority to remove books from shelves if he so chooses, which a lot of librarians spoke out about, in public comment with their names, saying, hey, we really don't support this. This could, put our staff in a really weird situation. And there was also concerns that maybe the superintendent might face pressure from board members to remove a book without going through any kind of process or any kind of review. And then the other thing that the library policy revisions did was they took away the mandated library book review committee, which was something that it was a time, it took time, and they had to order the books to make the process happen, but they would have folks read the books and actually decide if this should be in the library or not. And now that committee is optional. So they don't actually have to go through that process. They can really just pull a book off the shelf if that's what they want to do. So definitely going to see the impacts of that going forward.
Wow, that's really surprising. I know there's a lot to cover, but I do want to circle back on the book, like what's going on in the libraries. For now, though, I know just like I'm seeing a lot of people talk about it in the chat. A lot of questions are coming. Great, keep that coming. People are asking about the bond. So let's go ahead and switch gears and talk about that really quickly. The HIC bond, the biggest school bond in Texas history. Voters are going to see this on the ballot in November. Megan, I know you've been covering the storyline extensively. So let's just start from the basics. What is a school bond and how is it paid for? And how can the district pay for one without a tax increase, if that's even possible?
Yeah, so schools are funded through a couple different sources, but one of the primary ones is through local property taxes, and that tax is split up into 2 parts. And the smaller part of that is called the interest and sinking tax rate, which, to keep it simple, is basically the debt the district owes. And to raise that rate, the district, or maintain it if they run out of debt, districts must obtain voter approval. And the way to do that is through a school bond election. So if schools don't pass a bond after, decades, eventually this tax rate is going to decrease because they stop owing debt to people. So the rate will go down. And so HISD is saying this billion bond would maintain the current tax rate that everyone is paying now. So it wouldn't be a tax increase. It just would be a maintaining of the current tax rate. However, if it doesn't pass and a future bond is not passed, people would eventually see a decrease in that tax rate. So that's why they're able to say it's not a tax increase because the rate is staying the same, but your taxes would decrease if the bond is not passed.
Okay, that makes sense. And so, in talking about the bond, what has Superintendent Miles said the bond money will be used for? Has he kind of gone into specifics or anything?
Yeah, sure. So if we're going to talk about parts and buckets again, the first bucket of the bond is to spend almost $2.3 billion on renovating, rebuilding about 40 different campuses. The district describes as having poor facilities or poor learning conditions. The second bucket would spend about $1 million on removing lead and making security and HVAC upgrades on almost all of HISD's current campuses. The third bucket would spend about $600 million on 3 new CTE centers and adding thousands more pre-K seats. And then it would also spend $440 million on technology upgrades. So all 3 of those buckets will be on in that one proposition, so Proposition A, but the technology upgrades will be on a separate proposition for people to vote over, and they can cast ballots on those separately. And that's because Texas law requires school districts to put technology equipment upgrades as a separate proposition on the ballot. So you can vote in favor of both, for one, against one, or against both.
Okay, got it. And this is again something, an initiative that is only available to people living within HISD's boundaries. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, right. Great. So then, a lot of issues. And after this event, actually, there's going to be a post-event survey. We are actually looking for, those of you on the Zoom joining us, like we want to hear from you. We want to hear from community members. Like, how do you feel about the bond? Is there any part that you disagree, agree, any part that you would change? So be on the lookout for that post-event survey. We want to hear from you. It's very quick to fill out, and there'll be a link in that survey.
Yeah,
So
can I add one more thing? Sorry.
please do, please do.
We've heard from dozens, if not hundreds of parents, students, teachers, community members, and several of them say they're not planning to vote for the bond because they've lost trust in state appointed superintendent Mike Miles and the appointed board of managers due to different decisions that they've made during their leadership of the district in the past year. I think some of the biggest concerns that I hear are principal and teacher turnover, and then broader concerns about how funding has been spent in the district in the past year, whether that's expanding the new education system, adding more top-level administrators who are paid more than 6 figures, and musical convocation. There's different concerns that people share. And not everyone in HISD is against the bond. There are surveys that show that people kind of generally support a bond with no tax increase. But it's notable that even a somewhat sizable group of people affiliated with HISD are not only vocally opposing the bond, but are also actively campaigning for it to fail.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and there's almost, I feel like this correlation that this is like Mike Miles's bond, right? And so maybe they want to support schools and they want to give more resources to schools, but then by voting yes, it almost feels like it's a vote of confidence in the superintendent.
Yeah, almost everyone I've talked to, and of course this can't be characterized to everybody, but a lot of people say, we support the idea of a bond, we support more funding for our schools, of course, but they don't want the bond to pass while Miles is in charge of the district. And it's definitely being framed by opponents of the bond as a referendum on Miles's leadership. Because as I mentioned earlier, you can't, there hasn't been an election to elect the school board. So this is kind of the first time that voters are able to kind of meaningfully cast a ballot that'll affect district operations.
Right, right. There's a great question that just came in the chat. Has a bond ever been passed in Texas under a state appointed board?
I am not sure. They're pretty rare, and
Sure.
so I don't know if I could answer that definitively. As we said, this would definitely be the biggest bond in state history. And so I'm not certain about that, but I think the reason I'm not certain is because state takeovers of school districts in Texas are relatively rare.
Right.
The law that made this possible, passed within the last decade.
Right, right. That makes sense. Yeah. All right. So, I know I see a lot of questions coming in on the bond specifically, and we'll try to get to more of those at the end of the session. But moving on a little bit more, school vouchers, another really big hot topic. We actually got so many emails on school vouchers coming in, in preparation for this event. So switching gears just slightly, that's a big storyline that we're following. Governor Abbott has said that this is going to be a top priority in the ledge this spring. So how do you see this impacting? I mean, obviously there's going to be impacts for HISD and also suburban districts, but I guess anyone, Elizabeth, Megan, decide, how, like, what are your thoughts? Anything you're hearing? How are you feeling like this is going to affect your coverage and the stories that we're following?
I can jump in first if that's okay.
Yeah, go for
Yeah,
it.
so I mean, what we know at this point is still pretty limited. We know that this kind of comes about, every legislative session, and that this legislative session, Governor Greg Abbott has said that he has the votes to pass this, and others and state leadership have said it's a top priority, it's a personal priority to get a school vouchers bill passed of some kind. Now, what that will look like, we don't exactly know, how far reaching that will be. If you'll be given a certain amount of money as a parent to, for educational purposes, or if that money will be sent to, a private school as to pay part of a tuition. I mean, we really don't know the specifics of what that will look like. But we do know how it's been impacting other states. I think there's about 12 states in the country with some kind of school voucher legislation. And Arizona definitely has the most wide-reaching vouchers program. And it's actually pretty recent. But one thing that Arizona has been facing is they had a $1.4 billion shortfall in their state budget, I believe, last year, and a lot of that had come from kind of mismanagement of funding around the school vouchers program that they created. So I think that's something we're going to really have to keep an eye on. If legislation does pass, we're going to have to see, where's that money coming from? Where is it going? And then another thing that's come out of reporting, in Arizona, where they have, as I said, the more complete vouchers program, is that some parents, when they receive a certain amount of money for educational purposes, the voucher money has been used on anything from like Lego projects to driver's ed to other, educational or educational adjacent programs, but not necessarily maybe the point of the bill for many families. And then one more thing I did want to touch on was there was recently a survey released by UH. It's the more recent survey that they did on vouchers, and about 2,200 people were surveyed, and actually 2/3 of the respondents, who are all from Texas, said that they would support vouchers legislation. And actually, interestingly enough, a majority of the people that did respond that they would support vouchers said that they still also believed in the common pitfalls, like that they take money away from public education and whatnot. But a lot of that pool of respondents, I believe it was like between 62 and 66% of those respondents who believed in the problems that could come from vouchers, also were from low-income backgrounds and maybe just didn't feel like that they're getting served appropriately from the public education system in general. So I think it was really interesting. It was surprising for many people, because you hear a lot of folks are very much against school vouchers, especially in the public education world. But you definitely also saw some parents kind of feel that frustration that they have every day with their local school. And so I think it just goes to show that, we really don't know what the effects of this will be. And the last thing that I will say is also, whatever that amount of money that the school voucher could end up being if legislation is passed, a lot of families still couldn't afford private school tuition with between $8,000 and $10,000 of extra money. That's not necessarily in the cards for most Texas families. So still, we really don't know how many people would take advantage of it or what it would look like, but that's what I can offer.
Right. No, that's great. That's really good insight. And Megan, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I want to jump in. We've talked a lot on this call so far about kind of the funding challenges that school districts have faced. Elizabeth talked about how different suburban school districts have had to make cutbacks. And, one of the reasons HIC is passing this bond because they don't have enough money in their general fund to fund, at least they say they don't, to fund things like HVAC services or lead abatement. And the reason I'm bringing this up in the voucher question is that the voucher bill was not passed, but because it was not passed, it also the billions of dollars in extra funding for public schools was not passed during not only the last legislative session, but several consecutive special sessions. So those two were tied together, and if one failed, the other failed. And so the the non-passage of the voucher bill has also meant that schools did not see a funding increase that they were expected to get, and thus have had to tighten their belts a bit more. Well, I think we can get into this a little more later in the call, but wanted to kind of mention that that's kind of, I think, related to HISD bringing the bond forward, and also kind of a lot of the other struggles that school districts have had throughout the year.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive, if you'd like, we can dive into that now, because I know a lot of people are concerned and are commenting on that, actually chiming in and commenting about it. So, does it look like in this upcoming session, I don't know, have you heard anything about what that bill looks like? If it is paired with, like you said, it's one fails, the other fails, like has anyone, I don't know if there's any inkling we have of that so far. Megan, since you brought it up.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth was saying earlier, we still don't know the exact thing of nature of the proposals, and even if they file a bill on the first day of filing that says, here's XYZ exactly what will happen, bills almost never look the same when they
Sure.
start to when they
Right,
end. So there will
right.
be months, weeks, if not months of negotiations over the specific language of the bill, and but that could potentially be tied to an increase kind of for the typical public school districts in Texas as well. So we don't know, but that's definitely an issue that our team is watching. And also the Chronicles state team in Austin is also covering very closely.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question that came in, and I think it's a little bit related, and we talk about like enrollment numbers are correlated to funding. And so, we talk about turnover and with students, not with teachers, HISD. So, do we have any sense of where these students are going? Are they going to private? Are they going to charter? Private is very expensive. And HISD is a very large urban district. So, Nusiba, I don't know if you can kind of chime in and answer that. Like, do we have any sense of where these students are going?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to the suburbs, they're going to charter, they're going to private school. We've heard from parents talk about where they're taking their students, and also the challenges. You have to think about distance and what makes sense financially for your family. There's also like unique cases, like if you're employed in a different district, or if there's an opportunity there in terms of like where you work. And so yeah, we've heard from parents. Bring their kids across charter, private, and suburbs.
Okay, great. There's, we spoke a little bit about budget cuts, and that's, related to school vouchers, actually, interestingly enough. But, the big cuts that are happening this year, I think it's really fascinating. Elizabeth, you mentioned the librarians, you mentioned libraries and buses, and these are in what I think many consider pretty well-off districts, but it sounds like maybe that's, there's the perception and there's the reality there. So I don't know, Elizabeth, if you can kind of talk a little bit more about how like maybe these suburban districts, like what kind of, why are these budget cuts happening beyond like beyond that legislative issue?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's been described to me by sources who are expert in school finance in Texas that it's a perfect storm of multiple different things, right? You have the end of the COVID relief funding, the state or the federal stimulus funding. It expired in September 2024, so there's no more use of that in this upcoming budget. And then along with that, it's important to inform people that the basic allotment, which is the funding that each school district gets per student that's sitting in the class, has not been increased since 2019. And I think that's sitting somewhere around $6,000, which is actually $4,000 below the national average of $10,000 per student. And now, obviously, state leadership would say that they have, funded school districts across the state historically with, school safety and other things, but that funding actually can't be used on, let's say, a teacher's salary, right? So, I mean, I think when you're looking at where that funding can actually be used without increasing the basic allotment to reflect inflation, which is obviously, as many of you know, with grocery bills and everything, that we're all feeling the effects of inflation this year. That's been another big thing. So with the basic allotment not being increased since before the pandemic and inflation and the fall of COVID stimulus funding, I mean, you're really seeing this perfect storm for school districts who just looked at their budget, and most of them, who still operate pretty lean to begin with, didn't even know, like, where is this going to come from? A lot of schools dipped into their fund balance, which is a last resort, honestly, because they can't, once that fund balance is spent, it's gone. So a lot of school districts are just basically hoping that there is increased funding coming in the legislative session this year, and I don't know if that is going to happen or not. But one thing I will say is that when we calculated the shortfalls across the region, and it was almost $1 billion in shortfalls in public education, specifically ISDs across the Houston area. So I mean, I think when you're looking and as you're a parent, if you're feeling the strain, you know, of those budget cuts, as so many are with transportation and Spring Branch ISD, for example, they ended up having to eliminate all their librarians. So they actually don't have librarians in the district anymore, which was a huge frustration for so many parents and teachers too, who rely on librarians to help with, you know, educating students. When you're feeling the impact of that, just know that it is all across the state, and to some degree, it is also across the nation. And there's only so much these school districts can do in cutting funding, because they have to cut from somewhere. Now, obviously, where the school district decides to make the cuts is pretty much where the accountability comes in, and where parents want to have a say. Many parents would have said, I want librarians no matter what. But unfortunately, that is not something that parents or teachers really have a say in. That's the board and the upper administration of these school districts. And then one more thing I wanted to touch on related to budgets is that upcoming in November, there's the bond obviously on the ballot, but there's also some tax rate increase elections that some school districts are basically trying to use as a last ditch effort to get a little bit of extra funding to try and, you know, get something where they can. So Alief ISD, Montgomery ISD, Magnolia ISD, and Spring ISD all have voter tax rate increase elections on the ballot in November. So they're basically taking it out to their constituents and saying, you know, is there anything else you can give us? Do you feel comfortable increasing your taxes for us to hire, let's say, you know, hire back some of the teachers that we had to cut, or provide more busing? And we'll have to see, you know, tax rate increase elections, which are called voter approved tax rate increase elections. And so the acronym is VATRE. They're generally pretty successful. I believe in November 2023, 85% of the elections that were held were approved. So we'll see if they are, but there's a lot of different ways that school districts are looking to recoup some of that funding. And the ones that can't, you know, they either had to make cuts or dip into their fund balance. There wasn't really another option.
Mm-hmm. That's really good to know. So we'll have time for one more question in our discussion, and then we'll move on to reader questions in the chat. So if you have a question for our education reporters, please drop that in now. But, you know, last question, obviously all this, like all the changes in HISD, NES, everything, like, you know, we now have Claire who covers student achievement, and specifically like how are students doing. You know, it's all about the kids, right? Like so Claire, I know that there are recently some achievement ratings that came out. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what the latest data says, and just like how did that data come about? Yeah, everything you have to know about student achievement right now.
Yeah, so I'm still fairly new to the beat, so Megan and Nusaiba may know more than me, but generally there was a huge jump in unofficial TEA accountability ratings among HISD that are now passing. So it was a huge jump. So that's something I'll be looking into is, you know, how did some of these schools go from even F to A, which is Mike Miles claims was HISD was the only district that saw schools jump from F to A, so that's interesting. And I'll also be looking at schools that maybe slipped through the cracks. So there were some schools that went from passing grades to failing in 2024. So yeah, it's really interesting. Obviously, some of the programs appear to be working, but again, these are unofficial ratings, and gonna have to get into specifics to see how it all went down.
Yeah, that's really good to know. Megan, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I want to jump in a little bit for some context over why these ratings are unofficial. The TEA changed its formula last year, so in 2023, on how it was going to calculate the ratings. And that formula was a much higher bar to achieve higher ratings. But there was a lawsuit that blocked the TEA from releasing those 2023 ratings. But school districts could release the ratings, calculate and release the ratings on their own. And that's what HISD did not join the lawsuit against the TEA, and they released their own ratings, which showed, I believe, 120 schools earning D or F ratings, which are failing ratings. And then this year again, in 2024, the TEA was blocked by a smaller lawsuit from releasing those ratings. So both years' ratings have been on pause unofficially, but HISD again released their own ratings, showing that I believe about 40 schools earned DRF ratings. And the TEA has confirmed that those R ratings were used through their calculations. So HISD didn't just decide. We have 121 schools that use the TEA's formula, and the TEA checked their data and confirmed that those are the ratings that the TEA would have assigned if those rates are official. And the reasons why it matters if these ratings are official or not, and why anyone even cares about these ratings, is first because they show how students are doing in schools. They're largely based on the STAR results, which is the state's method of determining if reading and math achievement among students. And it's not a perfect metric, but it's the metric that we use in Texas to measure outcomes. But the second reason is that it's the criteria for the state takeover of the district to end. So the first criteria is that HISD can't have any consecutive D or F schools. So schools that earned a D or F rating 2 years in a row, if there's even one of those schools out of HISD's 260 something, 270 something schools, the takeover will remain in place. So that is why a lot of attention is paid to these ratings. And HISD estimates they'll have about 10 or so next year. And of course, we're a year out, so that could change significantly up or down. But that is why that we are monitoring those very closely, and why a lot of attention is often given to these ratings, even though they're unofficial right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, thanks, Megan, for that insight. We're going to transition to reader questions. So we're getting so many of them, so I apologize if we can't get to everyone's comments, questions, but I promise we will read them all. After this, I'm actually going to provide a transcript to the education team. So if you have any comments for them, please drop them in anyways, and we'll try to at least read everyone's comments and questions. So let's first start off with, this was actually emailed in before the event, and I think I've seen several of these questions circling, about school choice vouchers. I know that there's a lot of unknowns there, but when this happens and what we see with other states, we find that the private schools, are they then, because if they accept voucher money, are they then held to any sort of state standard or TEA star test? Is there any sort of like assurance that this money, public money, going to private schools, that the schools are now beholden to anything that the public schools are beholden to? And that's more of a question for anyone who has the answers.
I'll just jump in to get the conversation started. Now, I'm going to jump in with this answer. I actually don't know exactly the specifics of accountability in other states, but I do know that that is a huge concern for a lot of families that might feel that, their taxpayer money is sent to school districts that have all these measures in place to hold them accountable for how they're using that money. And I do believe in other states there are times where they don't have, the same state mandated tests or the same state mandated standards. And so I think you get to the point where you're wondering, this is money coming from people's pockets that they hard earned. Is there any measure of accountability to make sure that the private schools that are receiving this tuition actually, are successful? I mean, and I think that's something that the state would probably do well to look at, like having some kind of accountability measure, at least from, the families that I speak with on a regular basis. And the other concern with school vouchers that I don't think we have mentioned before that folks have brought up to me is, a lot of money could be sent toward religious private schools. And so that's taxpayer money going to a religious private school. And, especially because tuition for a lot of, let's say, Catholic schools or religious private schools is not as expensive. So families might actually be more likely to be able to afford tuition at a Catholic school than perhaps, a very expensive private school in the area. So you could see a change or an influx of students that families are like, oh, now I have the tuition, I have the ability to send my student to this school and I want to, which is, that's their choice. But then I think with the families that are, paying their taxes and they don't want their taxes spent on religious private schools, I think that's where you get into a big conflict in it that honestly is ideological, right, with the separation of church and state. So that's one of the big concerns about school vouchers, but I will end there if anybody else wants to jump in on that.
I think you did great. I think that
Yeah.
covered.
I think you did great too. And I think that, and I see a lot of comments about people chiming and saying, no, they're not required. There isn't any accountability. So I know that, but there's so many unknowns right now, right? So, all right, let's move it. This is, I know that this has actually been a really big, we know that there's been a lot of tragedy, the other day in Rice campus. But there's a question here about like specifically, what is HISD doing? Are they enacting any new programs to combat violence? And or anti-Semitism in their campuses. And I thought this was just kind of an interesting question, separate from bonds and anything like, I know violence and crime is a really big concern for parents. Are y'all hearing anything about how they're trying to combat violence?
Yeah, I was actually gonna tie it into the bond. I know you said separate from the bond, but
Oh, okay.
one of the biggest proponents of the bond is to improve safety. So that's not necessarily violence, but things like having a kind of centralized entrance all schools have where everyone feeds into that one entrance to protect students and other staff so that people aren't just coming in through side entrances, to build fencing around schools, basically just to sturdy up the campuses. There's I think at least $1 billion to do that, and that should help, or that was what the district says will help prevent, I think, violence, not just violence, but also like people who maybe shouldn't be on the campus from being on the campus. We've also seen one of the kind of promoted aspects of the new education system is sort of a more crackdown on disciplinary issues. So one of the things that caught a lot of controversy initially is one aspect of the team centers is that students who are kind of causing disruptions in the classrooms will be sent to the team centers to learn from those instead. So those are some of the kind of things the district says they're doing to prevent different types of disruption or violence. I know that doesn't necessarily directly address the question, but I wanted to kind of talk about kind of safety and discipline in the response to that.
No, absolutely. I think that's perfectly relevant. All right, here's, I see this floating around sometimes is Mike Miles and the tax dollar story with his Colorado charter schools. And I know we've covered this, but I still see questions about this. And it seems like there's a lot of misinformation and people who are, maybe we're confused. So, Megan, can you just kind of very quickly, like how was this issue sort of addressed with I know he's talked about it, but like what's the latest and like how can you kind of summarize it for our readers?
Sure, I will take the talking stick, but then I will pass it future questions to my fellow colleagues. So Spectrum News, which is a broadcast media outlet, reported early in the year, I think it was April, May, that the charter school that Mike Miles founded and used to oversee at one point sent money from its general fund, took used money, took fees from its schools in Texas, put them into a general fund, and then funds from the general fund went to its charter schools in Colorado. And that itself is legal under Texas law. Schools are allowed to charge administrative fees of schools that they're overseeing in Texas and send them to schools that they're running in other states. But it prompted outrage from lots of people who were confused why the tax dollars that they pay to fund schools in Texas were going to schools that are outside of Texas. And I see people saying that Mike Miles is under investigation for this. He is not. TEA has announced that they are reviewing, I believe investigating the school districts themselves for, to ensure that the finances were spent properly. But the school districts themselves were ultimately responsible for approving where the funds went. And so the TEA is looking into like, was everything done properly? Was everything okay? But Mike Miles at the time was in Colorado, and so the TEA is looking into it in Texas, but it hasn't. Mike Miles himself is not being investigated for uh, the use of those funds.
Right. Here's a question that came in earlier in the conversation. Nusaiba, as you were talking about teacher turnover and how HISD is having to hire, teachers without certifications, is there any data that shows that maybe these teachers are, as far as student outcomes or anything, like, are they less effective? Are they generally like, do we have any data on how that is impacting students or I don't know, like, are there actually some pretty successful outcomes there?
It probably depends on what you're looking at when it comes to data, but what I can say is that the district has talked about like tied hiring uncertified teachers. In a recent board meeting, they've tied it to past vacancies, past years vacancies, and the need to fill teacher vacancies. And it's something that the district has prioritized at the beginning of this school year and the past school year as well, and trying to make sure you approach zero vacancies or as few vacancies as possible. And so that's sort of the district's perspective on that. But when it comes to data, I'm pretty sure, there's probably could open up a whole lot of discussion about what you're looking at and the
Yeah.
like the scope of that data. Yeah.
Is there any just off the top of your head, I know kind of putting on the spot here, but like one example of it being effective or maybe not so effective. Just curious, like, anything about student test scores or anything?
I'm not sure if I can speak to that because I don't have anything in front of me. I don't know, Megan, if you'd like to chime in there as pertains to like data pointing to the effectiveness of uncertified teachers.
Yeah, there's been different research on the topic. I don't know if there is a definitive yes or no. Uncertified teachers do bring a different perspective into the school district. We could I think one example is HISD passed a District of Innovation plan, which allows it to hire uncertified teachers in high schools who kind of specialize in certain fields. So think like welding or like engineering, things like that, things that are kind of a niche topic that it's kind of difficult to find teachers in. And they talked about how getting uncertified teachers, getting a certification for those teachers might be a barrier to filling seats. And so that those teachers could bring value to the classroom, even if they are not certified. On the other hand, teachers who haven't gone through the process of a certification haven't got as much kind of in-depth knowledge as a teacher who has. They maybe didn't study teaching in school. So those teachers that are certified, I'd say generally have more experience in the classroom and kind of are bringing kind of more background in the teaching subjects. So that is kind of a benefit that a certified teacher is able to provide. So there's not a yes or no answer, but I do think we have heard concerns from people who want a certified teacher in their classroom, want someone who's gone to school for teaching, has gotten the process of a certification, has several years of experience. A lot of parents want that for their children. And when they see that the district has hired hundreds of certified teachers this year and last year, that is not the best kind of person for their child.
Right. I know, this is something I didn't mention yet, but actually we have several people, Claire and Elizabeth, you're a parent, you have a teacher parent in your family, and we all know if any of us are close to teachers, we know that it is, man, like to see an expert teacher in action, it is like a thing of art. The classroom management skills, knowing how to, teach to students and all the different types and their learning style, it is truly an art. And I can kind of, I understand that as I have teachers close to me and my family, so I understand that totally. So moving on a little bit more. I'm seeing some questions on charter schools. Someone wrote in the chat, thanks for hosting the Zoom. Curious what insights you'd be able to share on charter schools in the greater Houston area, given that they now represent a pretty significant student population throughout greater Houston and neighborhoods. So I know this doesn't quite fall in anyone's coverage, but yeah, Megan, go ahead.
I can jump in once again and then maybe
Yeah.
pass the mic to Elizabeth. Last year, at least the data that we got showed a large, significant spike in charter school enrollment. So I think the biggest two networks in Houston are Yes Prep and KIP. And while Houston ISD was seeing thousands of students leave the district, those schools were seeing thousands of students enroll in the district. And those are public charter schools. So they're not private schools with $10,000 tuition. They are free. And I've seen HISD refer in different places to how charter schools in those areas are recruiting students from their campuses that they have and kind of near those schools. And the reason why, there's several reasons why that's important, but one of the main ones is that for every student HISD loses, it loses funding. So that means less money to support schools. And at a certain point, it just is not financially feasible to keep a school open if you don't have as many students or as much money. So that could lead to school closures, which will impact the students that are still enrolled in those schools. So not to take your charter school question and tie it back to HISD, but
Yeah, no.
charter school, there is charter school growth in Houston, and that means that that you got the number of students has to be decreasing from somewhere, and in Houston it's
Mhm.
from HISD, and that means it's a good thing for those charter schools, but it's means less money flowing to the HISD, which serves the majority of students in the city.
Yeah, and I can just come in with just a little bit to add, but I think from an anecdotal perspective, charter schools in some way kind of act as a litmus test for the neighborhood, like ISD or public school campus in the area. And I only say that because I think, especially, I mean, you actually see it mostly in underserved communities where you might have a public school campus that just isn't been doing well, hasn't been doing well for a long time. And a lot of those parents that I've spoken to, because I was actually at an opening of a new campus of a charter school on the southeast side of Houston, very far down there, called Rev Prep Academy. And I was there and I talked to some families who were enrolling their students, and they all kind of had the same idea, saying like, we believe that we can get smaller class sizes here. We believe that we can kind of avoid some of the pitfalls of our public school campus in the area. That's why we want to come here. We believe that there's going to be some innovation, some change outside the norm. And that's not always the case. Charter schools don't always perform to the same standard actually as the public school in the area. And I think there is a lot of data to show that there are successful charter schools, but there are also charter schools that really aren't doing well. But I still think it's that idea is pretty ingrained in families of, when you really just feel helpless, like you don't feel like your school has your back, you don't feel like there's anywhere to go, that kind of charter school with a new building and kind of an innovative model or advertisement, that might feel like the way out. And so I think a lot of families really do take that seriously, and they do move their students for that reason. So whether or not it's successful in each case, that tends to be the emotions behind the decision to really want to move your child to a charter school.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we are actually almost at the end of time. I just want to echo again that the recording of this event is actually going to be available every week. We host these virtual Zooms with people in our newsroom or newsmakers, VIP guests, and they're always available afterwards on YouTube. So I see some questions. Yes, there will be a recording made available after this, where you can watch it as many times as you want. So there's that. And then we have time for maybe one more question. I see a lot of questions about just the specialty programs, and HIC, I think, is the one mentioned in particular, but in general, like people are bringing up special ed, magnet. How is that being affected? How are you seeing that being affected by the takeover? Like, have magnet programs basically been left alone? Is special ed affected? How can we how can we address this? So yeah, no, Saiba, go ahead.
Could kind of speak or recap a little bit what the district has said about this. But we'll have yet to see like what really happens in this upcoming year. So the district has what they call like autonomy levels for schools, like depending, and it's tied to the unofficial ratings of the schools. And so like depending on where they fall in this stratification of like how much autonomy they have, that's kind of maps to what extent the programs of their school will be affected, or like how they're going to approach different aspects such as like master schedule of the school. And so different magnet schools are categorized, according to this autonomy stratification. And so, yeah, we'll get to see like kind of to what extent like schools, keep their magnet programming, in the form that they do. It's supposed to be preserved like according to different levels, and the descriptions assigned to each level of autonomy that schools have.
Great.
Yeah, I want to jump in again. Sorry for kind of an
Apologize.
extension on autonomy. One thing that I think that's notable about the autonomy framework is that it was based on the school's 2023 unofficial scores. As I mentioned earlier, the TEA introduced a stricter formula, which meant that several schools, that along with some other things, meant that several schools dropped in their ratings. HISD went from about 10 to about 130 schools earning D or Fs. So that meant that those schools were assigned a lower level of autonomy due to those ratings. And before that autonomy level even kicked into place, they got improved ratings under the 2024 system. And so when we asked Superintendent Miles, why schools that improved in their ratings, are still going to be at this lower level autonomy, he talked about how he doesn't want to just change the level of autonomy every single year. So one year you're at this level of autonomy, then your grade goes up and you go back down or back up. So instead of moving schools up and down, based on their grades in a single year, schools will be given the same level of autonomy unless they have consecutive years of the same grade. So if you get a B, I think it's 2 or 3 years in a row, then you can move up in the ratings, or if you get a D, your rating will change after several, you're not just going to be going up and down willy-nilly. And so that has sparked some concerns from parents who say, like, my school was, maybe had one bad year, but now it's up to a B or A. Why are we in this level of, autonomy for, just because of our ratings in 1 year? And it's the reason, the answer to that from the district is we don't want to just be changing the autonomy right and left.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. On that note, thank you everyone for joining us, panelists, for taking your time to join us today. Readers, we appreciate you joining us. I know there are so many questions, so many comments we did not get a chance to answer, but please, if you can, fill out that post-event survey. We will read every response. We would love to hear from you specifically on the bond issue, so please take the time to do that. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks so much and have a great day. Bye.